and Paul Fahey. Like I just I forgot to customize the banner because we actually have a third person with us. I'm Mike Lewis. I'm here with DW or Dave Lafferty, one of the Daves I know, and we are also here with Where Peter Is contributor Paul Fahey, who is coming to us from Michigan. I am Mike Lewis, the editor of wherepeteris.com. This is the Critical Catholic. And so here we are today. Our topics on the Critical Catholic, a place where Catholics come together to speak about. We should really have like a tagline, don't you think, Dave? Sorry,
yeah.
Come up with that before we went live, but I'm like,
yeah. This is not the time to brainstorm, I think, but that's okay. We'll
if any of our listeners or viewers would like to put a tagline in the comments, be my guest.
I don't mean to come to your show and then be critical, but you also need a new theme song, I think. This is the first time I heard it at normal speed, because usually I listen to the podcast at 1.5 speed. It's better at that speed.
You know what? I thought it's funky. It's kind of like, I was thinking like I wanted like a 1978, like, I don't know, low budget detective show vibe. And I thought I captured that. So that's what Dave wanted.
I'm into it. I like it a lot.
I'm into it. It's a little
gets me in the zone for this.
It's sort of like an alarm clock in some ways. If you were asleep, you're not anymore, but you might not be happy about being awake.
At 1.5 speed, it moves into the like mid to late 90s, and that's more my era. So
okay, yeah, a little more up tempo.
Yeah, Dave and I are 1970s kids.
Yeah.
You're older than geriatric millennials.
Yeah, I was born in July 1979. So I am not a millennial, technically speaking. Although on the website, millennialjournal.com, I qualify because I was born in the JP2 era. That's their cutoff. But every other cutoff, I am technically. That's why I actually like Oregon Trail generation, because kids born from 1977 to 1983 or so, which is really, I don't know. We grew up watching He-Man.
I played Oregon Trail as a kid on my dad's DOS computer.
No. We had computer class. It was they would shuffle all 24 of us into the computer lab where they had the Apple IIes set up, where we would each choose a 3.5-inch disc and pop it into a workstation, and the luckiest kids got Oregon Trail. Well, no. The luckiest kid got Space Quest 2, but there was only one copy of that, but there were like 30 copies of Oregon Trail. So that's what we wound up playing. Anyway, Dave,
yes.
why don't you kick us off? Give us a prayer, give us a topic, introduce this guy in the middle right here.
All right. Well, just to get us going, we'll do our prayer that we usually do at the beginning. So, in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, please guide us in our discussion. Help us to dispel confusion, discern fact from fiction, and cleave to the truth. Allow us to contribute to the creation of a healthy Catholic media culture. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. So, welcome, Paul. It's nice to see you here again. For the first time on our show, but I always enjoy talking with you.
I don't.
No, yeah, Mike hates it. So
this time, I'm looking forward to this version of Paint of Paste, though. I might enjoy myself this time. Although he did make fun of my song selection, so
right off the bat,
not a good way to start.
One of the reasons that we thought it would be cool to have you on is you've written on this idea of Christendom and the role that Christendom plays in the Catholic imagination. So just before we get to that, though, I thought I'd just offer a really brief introduction about what we're hoping to address tonight. So What we're going to be looking at is maybe a kind of conspiracism that's related to this idea of Christendom and this idea that the church has lost a lot of power, and some people in the church are trying to regain that power in whatever way they can, even if it's sort of an imaginary version of Christendom. And we're going to look at some of the conspiracy thinking that can come out of that. So just to start off with, like when people start talking about Christendom, right away we're getting into a sort of like grandiose mode of thinking, right? So we're talking about the dominion of the Catholic Church and the authority of the Catholic Church. And when we're talking like this, and we're talking about the church in general, we all have a tendency to generalize and make these kind of sweeping statements, and that includes when we're talking about the enemies, or who we consider to be the enemies of the church, and the ideologies that we oppose. Now, that's not all that unusual in Catholicism. A lot of popes in the past have spoken that way, offering these sort of blanket condemnations of all sorts of social and political movements or great civilizational shifts. Although recent popes have been more restrained in that regard, I think over time, the position of the church becomes more subtle, more complex. But I think we have a situation now where this sort of grandiose thinking and language, which really has its home in maybe more like the 19th century, if we're talking about the church, it's infected politics. And then, so in both politics and the church these days, we've seen this a lot on the right. And there are some, clergy who are modeling this language. So people like Archbishop Vigano, Cardinal Mueller, Cardinal Burke, Bishop Athanasius Schneider. I mean, reading their stuff, they're truly pontificating when they talk. They're talking in these grand, like kind of world historical terms, about, these huge battles of good versus evil and the role of the church and that sort of thing. When you look to the writings of Pope Francis, although he does make some very prophetic statements sometimes, he doesn't tend to use that sort of language. So I think, when this is the same for popes of the, really ever since, Vatican II. And, I think that these people like Archbishop Vigano, and they're really what Pope John the 23rd referred to as the prophets of doom. This was the idea that we're trying to go beyond this sort of condemnatory view of society, where we're just kind of issuing these, grand declarations that just, condemn entire ideologies and movements and other religions and that sort of thing into something more subtle. So what we see when we see this coming up again, it's almost like we're seeing the voice again of a church that claims dominion over all people, but it also is suffering from this kind of persecution complex, I guess you could say, because the actual power of the church and the actual power of Catholicism has been, greatly weakened over the course of the centuries. So, Paul, you wrote about how there's been a change in thinking in the church on this front, and this was in a piece that you wrote for Where Peter Is, called "The Church's Mission and the Allure of Neo-Christendom." And you quote Austin Ivory, who said that Pope Francis follows the thinking of the Second Vatican Council in believing that, quote, "the primary focus of the church should no longer be on the defense of neo-Christendom." So I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on this idea of neo-Christendom and the role it plays, and maybe how someone like Pope Francis or the Pope since Vatican II have been trying to move beyond this idea.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. The rest of that quote from Austin is because neo-Christendom is all about power, and I think that's the key thing. There were two things that really got me thinking about this idea of Christendom, and both of them, it was right after the riot at the Capitol on January 6th. I was on a friend's Facebook page the week after, and they had posted about, like, look at all the crosses and Christian signs that were at this mob, and we're in the midst of this mob, and Christians, we need to repent of this, right? And someone commented, and he's a professor at big Catholic university, and he said on this public post, and he, like, without any type of shame, he said, I'm not going to repent, right? To be welcomed, this is a quote, to be welcomed in the halls of power and protected by the people in them is something I will forever be grateful for, right? And I'm like, you said the thing that you're not supposed to say out loud. But
was he there? Is that what he was? Was he actually present, or was he just in favor of?
Yeah, he was. The context of the discussion was, hey Catholics, hey Christians, we should be repenting of hitching our wagon to Trumpism. And he's like, absolutely not, because they gave me, meaning conservative Christians, a seat at the table again, right? And I think power is the key thing. And around that time, that quote really struck me, because I'm like, he just said the real thing. Like, that's the truth. That's the mentality. And I was reading Pope Benedict's famous, when he was, I think, Father Ratzinger, back in the 60s, late 60s, I think, the radio address where he talked about, he envisioned the future church, right? And he talks about how the church is going to lose the spaces of power that it holds in society now. And the number of adherents will decrease, and the church is going to lose her social privileges, right? And I heard this statement, or this homily back in college. And back then, my impulse was to think, yeah, I'm in that smaller church. We got to get rid of all those liberals and all those heretics, and it's us pure, faithful, Orthodox people that are going to be there. But he goes on to say in that article, he's like, he doesn't outright say that this is good, right? But he says the church of the future is going to be more faithful because it's going to be a church of saints, right? And this reflects, last week, David French wrote a great article, and he was quoting Soren Kierkegaard, who talked about how Christianity gets better the more that Christendom decreases, right? Because Christendom is all about maintaining spaces of privilege and power in society. And when that becomes the primary mission of Christianity, we compromise our integrity in order to do that. And we turn the Christianity into another ideology or another political movement. And we compromise our values when we do that. And the instances of this in the past, few years are numerous, but instances of this throughout the history of the church are numerous, when the church tries to maintain its space of power. So I think what Vatican II did, and obviously what Pope Francis carries on, is we need to look to the early church, right? Ressourcement. And the early church had no social privileges and no social power, and yet it spread like wildfire in the first few centuries in the Roman Empire because of its credibility, because of its witness, because of not having a persecution complex, but actually being persecuted for the sake of its values and in the radical integrity that it had. So I think that's the shift that Vatican II was moving the church in, and Pope Francis certainly carries forward, is we're not interested in grasping at these social privileges that we once held, that are even been taken from us. And there's a sense of mourning, right? Because, hey, we built the hospitals, we built the universities, we built this culture, and now it's being ripped from us. And I kind of get the sense that Vatican II and Pope Francis are like, that's fine. Actually, may even be better if they're stripped from us, because what we need is something pure.
And you might even say that this is something that's played out in church history over and over again, that when the church does acquire temporal power and it's able to sort of solidify its position, a kind of stasis sets in, and then eventually a sort of corruption. And then you get, these big events happening, right? Like the Protestant Reformation and that sort of thing, where you get this sort of falling away because people, can no longer connect to the institutional church. It seems so distant from how they actually experience Christianity. And I mean, I think that's what Kierkegaard was talking about. I'm not super familiar with Kierkegaard, but I do know that he lived at a time where, I forget exactly where he lived in Europe, but the church was heavily institutional. And, everyone went to church and everyone kind of just did their thing. And it was just totally normal that, everything revolved around the church, but it was completely dry. It was completely void of any real personal connection. It was just something that was taken for granted. And, he was looking for that sort of raw existential connection to God that he was missing from this institutionalized version of the church. So I think that's a really interesting thing to bring into the discussion.
And I just chose to highlight this one quote from your piece, Paul, that the Catholics who are pining for privilege and influence, who want to win back spaces of power, they correctly see that the Pope doesn't support their efforts. I think that that's one of the factors here. It's interesting because we have this whole integralist reaction. We have these traditionalists who are in favor of an authoritarian church. And the paradox that they're facing right now is that Pope Francis, in a way, well, he's not the type of authoritarian that they want. I think that the Pope, by his nature, has authority. And, people have debated over whether, I remember Dan Amiri and I had a conversation like, well, is Pope Francis an authoritarian pope or is he not? And I think while he enjoys the discussion and the dialogue and seeing where the movement of the Holy Spirit is, and there's this whole talk about synodality, not just talk, but it's his vision. His vision is one of a synodal church, but he is very clear. And he used the phrase, the Pope is the guarantor of it all in the 2014 synod. Like this is the reason why we can trust the synodal process is because it's with and under Peter. And we as Catholics, doctrinally speaking, especially in light of what was taught at Vatican I and then the subsequent popes, it's that the Pope is the guarantor of orthodoxy. The Pope has divine assistance, even in his, like Pedro Gabriel's pointed out, even in his disciplinary decisions, we believe that the Pope, maybe he's not making the wisest or most prudent decisions necessarily, but he is, but the Pope does receive divine assistance throughout his papacy. And I think Pope Francis very much embodies that.
And
the problem is what he's doing is not what they want him to do.
Yeah. He also has an authority, even if you set aside his magisterial authority, he has authority in the world because he's credible, right? I remember I was at a conference several years ago, and Sherry Waddell was there. She's the author of Forming Intentional Disciples, and she was talking about she had a team of people, evangelists who were just striking up conversations with people at the big papal mass in Philadelphia when the Pope visited. So she shared some of that experience. She's like, yes, we had people who went to that mass, and I was at that mass. My wife and I were able to be there, and you had to wait in line for hours to get a spot. I mean, mass
among the million people on the highway, right? I mean,
yeah,
it was
so mass was like 4 PM, and you had to be there at like 9 AM, right? So they were talking to people. They're like, hey, why are you waiting in line and stuff? Are you Catholic? And they're like, no, I'm not Catholic. So why are you spending your entire day out here in line? Oh, I love what this Pope says about the environment, and I just want to hear more, right? They were like, this place was ripe for evangelistic conversations because the Pope already had trust built and credibility because of his teaching, but also because of his way of life. So I think that's the church is no longer about, or the church of this generation isn't about the Holy Roman Empire. It's about church as field hospital.
Yeah, I think Pope Francis, he doesn't exercise his authority, which he does have that authority. He doesn't exercise it as like a monarch. He exercises it as a servant. I think that's the role that he sees himself playing a lot of the time. So he's giving of himself first, and placing humility first. And I mean, that's following the model of Jesus, I think, who had that authority that came through that humility and that willingness to serve others. Now, if people are looking for this authoritarian pope, and I think that they would have been disappointed with a lot of the popes in the recent relatively recent past as well. If they can't
there is no sense of history.
No, there's no sense. No, it's because it's not like Pope Benedict or Pope John Paul ruled as like monarchs. They still had that same posture of humility. Probably Pope Francis is the one who has taken it the furthest, and it's most apparent with him.
I think he perhaps recognizes the value of it. Right? I think they're exaggerated gestures because he knows that that's important.
Yes, like kissing the feet of people and politicians. I've seen that. It's pretty startling to see. But if he's not living up to their idea of what a pope should be, this sort of authoritarian figure who just issues condemnations, they will construct their own version of either Francis, and I think that some of the integralists that I've read do this. They read Pope Francis esoterically to place him within their integralist framework, and it requires a lot of sort of really twisty logic to position him that way. Now, at least though they recognize Pope Francis as the Pope, but others who don't, who are looking for something even better, they will turn to someone like Archbishop Vigano, who's become a sort of counter pope for the disaffected traditionalists. And I think that's where you can, in both of these cases, things can get very dangerous because you're dealing with a sort of imaginary pope. You're dealing with an imaginary version of the church. It's not really one that's rooted in the church as it is right now. And so you're entering into this sort of mythical realm where you're fighting maybe imaginary battles, and that's where I think a lot of the conspiracism and a lot of the twisting of reality can come into it, and that's where I think as Catholics we have to keep our critical faculties sharp in order to recognize, well, first of all, let's look to the church as it is. Let's look to the person who is actually Pope, what he is saying, and what other people in the hierarchy are saying, and work with that to begin with. Not work with this imaginary version of the church that we have in our heads. That's why a lot of traditionalists are just endlessly railing against the bishops, because the bishops could never in a million years live up to what they think a bishop should be doing, and the Pope could never live up to what they think a Pope should be doing. So yeah, I think that's a theme that comes up again and again, is that there's a lot of people who have a sort of imaginary version of the church they're defending. Sometimes they'll try to squeeze Pope Francis into that vision. Other times they'll just reject Pope Francis entirely and find someone else who can play that role.
So one of the questions I ask is why? Like, what motivates someone to want this strongman pope, right? And I think it's wanting a sense of security. So I work in parish ministry. I don't do spiritual direction, but spiritual conversations, I don't know, with lots of people. And like one of the basic spiritual principles, which you could call critical thinking, but it's like discernment of spirits, right? Someone has a specific desire or opportunity, but something that they're discerning. And one of the questions is the good spirit motivating this or behind this desire, or the bad spirit, right? And what are the signs of one or the other? How do you tell? And one of the key things that unmasks the bad spirit is fear. Are you acting out of fear? because the Lord doesn't prompt fear. The good spirit doesn't bring us fear. It may challenge us, certainly, but not fear. Fear comes from the bad spirit. And I think that there's a profound sense of fear, both amongst those seeking conspiracies and amongst those who are wanting this strongman church, those who are afraid of losing the seats of privilege and power that the church once held. Maybe the church will be irrelevant. Maybe the church will even be persecuted, and there's fear of persecution. I think of Cardinal George and the saying that he says, where he's like, "I'll die in my bed, and my successor will die in prison, and their successor will die a martyr." I hear people quote this with almost a sense of like, that's where it's going, folks. You know, we got to prepare for this type of persecution, but I think there's this real fear behind it. But I think ultimately that comes from a lack of trust in his power and his providence, and especially a lack of trust in the promises he's made to the church, right? The indefectibility of the church and the promise that the church is going to prevail.
I think, and not to dial back too far and not to get too high up on my soapbox, but I think one of the things you said when you described what Sherry Waddell had to say, you know, the people that she was encountering at that Philadelphia Mass, and one thing that Pope Francis had a very strong sense of, that I don't know that Benedict maybe had that same sense or that same concern, but was the understanding of contemporary people and what motivates them and what inspires them and what, where we can find that common ground. I mean, yes, care for creation, climate change, making sure that, that our environment, that we're good stewards of the earth. That's all crucial. The question is, why has Pope Francis made it such a priority? Well, I think part of the reason is this is where the Catholic Church and the far left or progressives or atheists, it's a really strong area of common ground, and the religious people in terms of environment. I mean, it's a huge movement that maybe doesn't get as much attention in the US. But if you go to Africa, if you go to Latin America, and we're not talking about leftists here, we're talking about like people who really do care about the poor. And I mean, the whole issue of climate refugees, people who's people in Latin America, people in Africa who are forced to migrate because the land is no longer farmable, or because natural disasters have wiped out their area. I mean, Pope Francis understands this, and he sees it as a point of confluence, a point where our common aims and our fraternity cross over. And yet this reactionary, this conspiratorial, this neo-traditionalist movement pushed back so hard against what Pope Francis was trying to do there. And I also felt like there were so many things that he did early on that resonated with people, and they did almost everything in their power to break people's trust of him. I mean, you think about appealing to, like, early on, I think there were a lot of, for lack of a better term, conservative Catholics who were trying to give Pope Francis the benefit of the doubt, despite the fact that there were a lot of traditionalists and a lot of commentators who turned on him very early on, who were saying negative things about him very early on. But then they were able to stoke fear in anticipation of the Synod on the Family. And, they got to a few church leaders like Cardinal Burke and some of these other church leaders to really, really, you could sense they were fearful of what would happen. They were fearful that the spirit of the world or whatever would enter the church, that the smoke of Satan would enter the church. And I think, so that's why I pinpoint the dubia as that first moment of where they were able to break the trust of the Catholic people towards Pope Francis. They were able to convince them that Pope Francis was some kind of heretic or some kind of heterodox person. Yeah. The real breaking point, however, because that's sort of a nitpicky niche issue that most Catholics and most people around the world don't care about all that much, was the Vigano testimony. They were able to take that goodwill and take the issue that people globally, inside the church, outside the church, the biggest negative, the biggest thing that can harm the church in the modern era is sexual abuse and the cover-up of sexual abuse. And they were able to take this Vigano narrative, which, even though it was debunked largely within 2 days, and even though the McCarrick report shows that he's actually one of the people that's most at fault for what happened with McCarrick, for McCarrick not coming to justice prior to Francis's papacy. I think that really did a great deal of harm to the opportunity to evangelize in the church. I think, and it's almost, so it's like they were trying to work against the Pope's efforts to evangelize because they didn't see eye to eye with his vision.
And I think, a lot of this stems from the fact that for people who are looking for something to ease their fears, ease their feeling of powerlessness and inferiority, Pope Francis is not offering them a lot, because, and I've had to come to terms with this as someone who, I considered myself a conservative and a fairly, deeply conservative person, and conservative Catholic. And over time, I've had to come to terms with the fact that conservatism, although I do still believe that there are good forms of conservatism, it can be a cover for fear and insecurity and feelings of powerlessness and wanting to dominate others, a kind of like resentment-based ideology. And so anything that can help to separate the church from the rest of society is good for a conservative, because it gives you this feeling that you're standing against the culture, that you are special, that you are, you're rejecting all of this, modern nonsense. And, Pope Francis, he's not letting people do that. He's telling people, no, actually, we have to cooperate on stuff like climate change. We have to, we have to look to find paths for establishing human fraternity with people from other religions and other cultures. And, and this is so unappealing to the conservative mind in some ways, right? Like, because you're not special then. You're working with the people that you really hate. And
we want homilies about how bad the world is.
Yes, and how great we are.
That's right. The real problem is not racism. The real problem is atheism.
Yes. Yes, because everything comes down to people not being holy enough like we are, like that's, as if that's the solution to everything. I mean, well, maybe in a certain sense it is, but practically speaking on the ground, no. So, David French in that article that you mentioned, and this was, I don't know if I have the title of it, but it was on American Christendom.
Yeah, here it is. How American Christendom weakens American Christianity.
Yes, weakens American Christianity. And he talked about, how, he's been very concerned about how evangelical Christians jumped on the Trump bandwagon, especially after, their initial reaction to Trump was one of horror. And, but something happened and they decided, oh, actually, maybe Trump
Catholics
is the guy. And Catholics too jumped on it. And I'll admit, at first I was like, all right, well, let's try this Trump thing, and let's see what happens. And it's better than Hillary.
Which one of us is breaking
up? Easy for you to stay up in Canada.
Yeah, it's easy for me to say. I was like watching from the sidelines, and I was like, all right, Trump, cool. but I didn't quite realize just how far this would go and just how bad it was. Now, he says, there's one quote that I took from his article. He says, what if white evangelical Christendom had said no? What if the institutions of the faith had opted to lay down their political arms rather than wield the weapon of Trump? What if they had said they would rather risk persecution than inflict pain, that they would rather lose their power than defend lies? And to me, that's really powerful, because I've seen, and that's what really has, it's been such an incredible faith challenging experience, but ultimately I think a good experience in the end, is seeing how people jumped onto the Trump bandwagon and then also defended outright lies and told lies and spread misinformation, all because that might help, a particular Catholic cause, or it might help, boost the image of the church, or further a sort of traditionalist or integralist vision. And to me, that it really crossed a line, because, that's one of the things that I feel is so important to Catholicism, that we can't defend lies. That's not how Catholics work. We're very strict when it comes to lying. Lying is intrinsically wrong. It's an intrinsic evil. And so to use that for any purpose, it really can't be justified according to Catholic thinking. So I think, that leads us into this realm of highbrow conspiracism that I wanted to talk about. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
That passage from David French stood out, and it goes along with another passage where he's talking about sexual abuse in an evangelical church, and so he asked the question, what if the institution decided to die? So he said, what if it decided that its continued existence was irrelevant compared to the necessity of repentance and justice, and it should close before it denied truth and restitution to the children who were so terribly victimized on its grounds? The institution of Christendom might wither away, but would such a profound act of humility and obedience actually harm the faith? Right? So I think even greater than Trump, especially in the Catholic Church, was this emphasis on grasping at not losing power, at the cost of covering up the abuse of kids, of saving the institution. Because what if the institution fails? And in doing so, not just harming people, and maybe the worst way you can harm people, but just destroying the church's credibility for decades, and who knows how many more decades, right? To me, this is the epitome of choosing Christendom over Christianity, over the gospel.
And that's a huge part of the tragedy of the abuse crisis, is that we saw, for decades, that every effort was made to cover things up, to minimize what happened. That's something that often happens, like, oh, well, abuse happens everywhere. It's not just in the church, like that sort of stuff. And then, it was really a concerted effort to cover it up, to make excuses, to sometimes portray the people, the victims, or the people who were bringing attention to this problem, as enemies of the church, as anti-Catholic. And I mean, I think that was maybe more prevalent, like in the 2000s or so. Like I remember that sort of discourse in Catholic media, and then eventually, I think we're slowly coming to terms with it and realizing that no, this was a really world-shaking problem that we went through.
My fear, this is my own fear, talking about spiritual discernment. My fear is that the institutional church hasn't learned its lesson. So right now, the Attorney General in my state is finishing up their own report on all the dioceses in my state. And from the report so far, it's supposed to be really bad. And I'm genuinely, I don't know, I don't think the church has learned its lesson at this point. I think there's still going to be things that they haven't brought to light, and they're only going to bring to light because they're forced to, and it's going to bring it all up again.
And we're probably going to continue to have, people like Archbishop Vigano who will try to weaponize the abuse crisis in order to, in his case, he really tied it to this idea of a homosexual conspiracy within the church, implying that, any priest who happened to be homosexual maybe necessarily had this sort of proclivity for abusing children, and trying to show that this was like endemic and this was going all the way up to the Pope potentially. That was the kind of narrative that he was pushing forward, and it was extremely powerful. It caught a lot of people's attention. A lot of people believed it right off the bat, and it took them a while to realize that Vigano was constructing something that in his own self-interest.
And I and sorry about I'm back. My hopefully it was only me who was having the technical issues, because
it's fine. Yeah,
because you guys were breaking up on me like crazy. So I don't know if our audience could see, but I've talked to several priests actually who maybe weren't following the intra-church wars prior to Vigano very closely, but they had no reason to distrust Vigano. And in a lot of cases, his testimony had, and they've since kind of come back, or they've realized that he was unhinged. But at the time, he really put his grips into people. It's like he really did a great deal of damage. I knew that a lot of what he was saying wasn't true, because I live in the Archdiocese of Washington. I worked for the USCCB. I was there prior to Francis's election and saw McCarrick operating pretty freely. He'd show up at various events, at ordinations, and I even saw him in Rome, at a big event, and there were no sanctions on him. But other people, I think it was sort of like they were wary. He really captured fears that maybe people had buried deep down, and then because he was being so sensational, and because he was so insistent, and because certain parts of the Catholic media were pushing his narrative, CNA, EWTN, the usual suspects, the National Catholic Register, were all, LifeSite especially, were pushing his narrative, and man, he has a lot to answer for.
Yeah, and once again, it comes back to this idea of fear, right? It's this idea that there's a conspiracy, in this case, a homosexual conspiracy of pedophilic priests who are trying to destroy the church from within. And that really plays into a lot of suspicions that people have, and, like kind of their darkest, fears and worries. And he brought that all out into the light and tried to give it some legitimacy. And it was, extremely powerful. I don't want to shift too rapidly here, but I was thinking maybe this ties into some of the stuff that I'd like to talk about regarding this idea of highbrow conspiracism.
Oh, I was going to make that transition.
But you were going to transition?
Yeah, okay, that's cool. But you did it, so it's good. We're on topic 2. We have 15 minutes left.
That was barely a transition that I made. But so I came across this article by Laura K. Field, from the Niskanen Center. It's a think tank, and it's called "The Highbrow Conspiracism of the New Intellectual Right: A Sampling from the Trump Years." And I thought for one thing, it addresses some Catholic commentators that we are familiar with, and it really seemed to fit in with what we've been talking about. So she describes, first of all, this the what she calls the new conspiracism of the Trump era, and she's actually quoting a couple of authors here, Russell Moorhead and Nancy Rosenblum, for the with this idea, and they describe this new conspiracism as conspiracy without the theory. So it's a type of conspiracy theory that's not based on, the sort of meticulous, obsessive research, like like the JFK conspiracy stuff, where people can spend decades poring over files and looking at maps of the grassy knoll and all that kind of stuff. It's not like that at all. It's just a case of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. So a kind of fire hose of misinformation. And that's what we saw develop in the MAGA online world, and then especially the Pizzagate and QAnon style conspiracism. But at the same time, though, Field says that there are these, what she calls highbrow theorists. And, some of these are professors and journalists who are providing, or have been providing, a sort of theoretical backdrop to all of this as a way of creating a larger narrative that takes advantage of this underlying environment of misinformation. And she says that these conspiracists use the technique of hyper abstraction. So they make grandiose abstract claims without really backing them up at all. Or some cases, the evidence they provide is just sort of stuff dredged up from this world of conspiracism. So she says, I'll quote her here. She says, whereas the new conspiracism that Moorhead and Rosenblum describe involves flagrant fabrication, the intellectual conspiracism of the new right involves theoretical claims backed up by bad arguments and scant evidence. Under Trump, these two distinct ideational universes worked in syncopation. They were constituted differently, but typically they shared the same targets, played off the same conservative tropes, and had the same disorienting effects. So she divides them into three groups, and she says there's the nationalists, the pseudo-republicans, and the religious traditionalists. And it's the last group where we find the the Catholic version of this. And these are people who, she says, the characteristic of this type of highbrow conspiracism is the over-ascription of secret malicious intentionality, coordination, and control to an already powerful group or institution. So they're basically, and that was a quote there, they're basically exaggerating the amount of coordination that's going on in among their enemies. And she identifies Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule as being part of this last group. And I think we could definitely add Sohrab Ahmari. I think he really encapsulates this idea where he's writing this sort of high-minded stuff about tradition. He's got like a new book out right now. At the same time, he's working for the New York Post, kind of, putting out this sort of muckraking political stuff that's, very populist, conservative in orientation. So she says that, there's three sort of techniques that they use, and one of them is exaggerated attacks on the political opposition. And you see this all the time and I've seen Deneen and Vermeule and Ahmari do this all the time, but they play up this idea that the left, and they're never specific about what the left actually means. That the left seeks to destroy America, seeks to destroy Western civilization, to, eradicate religion and the family and all this kind of stuff, right? There's exaggerated attacks on existing institutions. So like the idea that the universities are completely filled with left-wing radicals who just brainwash students and then send them out into the world. And then there's exaggerated attacks on the political system itself. So the idea that like elections are just illusions, that the outcome is all controlled by the elites. And I think it comes back to this idea of Christendom that we were talking about, and that when you have this sort of imaginary Christendom, because it seems like these guys really believe that, the integralist vision is one where one of imposing Catholicism by, I won't necessarily say by force, but through laws and institutions and not through evangelization.
Pressure.
Pressure. Yes. It's
rather
pressure.
than it's imposition rather than proposition.
Yes, exactly. So it's, if we can change the laws, if we can get a hold of the reins of power, we can essentially force people to believe, because they're all stupid anyway, and
Yeah,
they'll do whatever the elites tell them to. Now, if we can become the elites, we can tell them to do things, right?
if the goal is power, right, then the mission is coercion. That's the whole point, right?
Yes.
Which is which goes against, it was in and maybe this is a side tangent, but I don't care.
No, that's all right.
It was in Pope Francis's letter about Saint Joseph back in December. He had a paragraph where he was talking about the title of Joseph as most chaste. Like, what does that mean? But the Pope defines chastity as love free from possessiveness, that does not desire to control the other, that respects the other's freedom. So he says, God loves us with the most perfectly chaste love because he respects our freedom. But that is the heart of chastity, which goes against all of this, right? Which goes against all of this idea that we need to grasp as much power as we can to force the world to be right or force the world to be good. I mean, this sounds like what conservatives are afraid of when it comes to communism, right? That they're trying to force people to all do the right thing.
It really connects actually with the older anti-communist sentiment, especially the really extreme anti-communism that used to exist in the United States. And I think one of the ways that they try to give themselves legitimacy and try to make people think that this is the only way that the church can actually have any influence in the world is they portray their enemies. And usually this means liberalism in general. Usually this means the left. Usually it could mean Black Lives Matter. It could mean, whatever. You have to portray them as being purely destructive, as being driven only by hatred, right? And this is part of I think a real characteristic of this type of thinking is that you generalize so much that you lose sight of the humanity of the people that you're talking about. And I saw this, and this is a bit of a thing that I like to go back to because it really bothered me when it happened. That this was one of the narratives that I know Adrian Vermeule often pushes, is that liberalism seeks to lower the age of consent and make pedophilia acceptable in Western society, right? So this is a narrative that he's constantly pushing. It seems anyway. And I don't know if you remember back with the Cuties controversy, there was this film Cuties that came out on Netflix. And
you caught a lot of heat for.
I caught a lot of heat. Yeah. Because I was defending this film because I sat down, I watched it. I'm like, all right, I got to check this out.
I just want to jump in right here as the editor, as the editor-in-chief of Where Peter Is. I do not control the Twitter accounts of the other contributors. They speak for themselves. And it's not just the Cuties thing, but it's I've had people come to me and say, hey, you guys like Cuties? And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. And just I'm sure he's got his reasons, and I'm sure there's a whole argument behind it. I don't want to be the one to give that. And you exonerate yourself very well when people ask you. The problem is they're also asking me. Yes.
So I take this entirely upon myself. That's entirely. And actually, I totally admit that if people are uncomfortable with Cuties and don't think it was an appropriate film, I think that's fine because it shows
Hans Kung.
Or Hans Kung, yeah. People, I like my Hans Kung now and then, right? But anyway, this Cuties thing, it was portrayed by conservative media as an attempt by kind of the Hollywood elites to get people used to the idea of underage girls' sexuality. Right now, if you looked into it, you'd realize, okay, the film was actually trying to do the opposite. It wasn't actually an American production. It was a French production by a woman who was from Senegal originally, and she was the director. It was actually a film that critiqued this whole idea of how Western capitalism tends to sexualize women at a younger and younger age, and how this stuff gets spread around on TikTok. And then these girls get kind of caught up in it, and they end up really embarrassing themselves and, learning this, moral lesson in the end about not kind of giving into this sort of Western sexualization. Now, so that was the actual message of the film, but some people in this, and Vermeil was doing this, would not stop pushing this idea that it was Hollywood elites trying to legitimize pedophilia or make people get used to pedophilia. And that was just false. It was a misrepresentation, a lie. And it's because, that's part of the, I think it seems to be anyway, part of the integralist method is you make liberals and you make liberalism seem as degenerate and awful as possible, and make it seem like the elites, who are always, liberals, are using these sort of techniques as a kind of like mind control to get people used to degeneracy, right? Now, if you look at the reality of liberalism, you'd know that, yes, there's a certain openness towards sexuality that comes with liberalism, but it's not quite in the way they imagine, right? Like with liberalism, you also get the intense focus on consent, right? On to an extent that conservatives have even critiqued that, the idea that both parties in a sexual relationship have to be consenting adults. And so liberalism, it's got that sort of inbuilt protection against any kind of sexualization of children in many ways. I think what they're actually talking about is how capitalism can sometimes, drive us towards these sexualized images, because that's what sells, right? It's not so much liberalism, it's capitalism. But that doesn't fit into the narrative that they're trying to put forward. And so they want to make things seem so terrible, like we're just on the verge of total degeneracy, societal collapse. We've got rioters, smashing everything, and we've got people trying to, turn us into pedophiles, and there's all these attacks on the family, and we've got the drag queens at the libraries trying to like indoctrinate our kids or whatever, right? That's the image of the outside world that they portray, and then they pitch this idea of integralism as the only solution. And it's going to be something that's going to have to be brought in sort of by force, because you're not going to be able to dialogue with any of these people, right? But that's the narrative that I think Pope Francis has completely exploded. He wants to talk with people. He wants to talk with all kinds of people.
It's interesting because with Vermeil, like I wasn't familiar with him prior to his conversion to Catholicism, and one of his things when he first became Catholic was his proud ultramontanism, which is a term that I don't personally subscribe to, but is, obviously all of us are used to hearing that from critics of where Peter is. But one of the things that really kind of troubled me early on was or the first chink that, eventually he blocked us and he was bad mouthing us and say, now he like can't stand us, even though here we are doing the same thing that we've been doing since the beginning. But was the Mortara case. The first things, this is what was his name? Eduardo Edgar Mortara. He was a Jewish boy who was baptized by his Catholic nurse in Spain, I believe, and because he was threatened with death, or he was at death's door, and he wound up surviving. And after that, the nurse then went to the church officials and said, "I baptized this boy. He's Christian," and the parents were Jewish, and they weren't going to convert to Christianity. And so what wound up happening, looking back at it, this was during the time of Pius IX, the second half of the 20th century. Pius IX wound up adopting him, and he was removed by force by church officials, and raised, I guess, in Vatican territory, and eventually became a priest. And I don't know a ton about what happened to him later, but First Things several years ago, I want to say about 3 years ago, wrote a piece defending what the church did. Basically defending the kidnapping or the denial of the parental rights of the kid. And I guess there's this whole symbolic argument about, he's a Christian and therefore he has a right to a Christian upbringing. But it was also, he was turned against his parents. His parents didn't consent. And I remember Adrian actually defended what happened back in the 19th century. And that seemed incongruent with, anything. I mean,
yeah, if you want to be an ultramontanist, well, think about what would Pope Francis say? Is there any way in a million years he would approve of that? No, I can't imagine that. There's just no possible way.
Well, I can't even see Pius XII doing
No.
I mean, that 3 Piuses later, that never would have happened. And probably, I doubt Pius XI would have gone. Pius X might have been okay with it, but Pius XI, I don't even think would have been okay with it. Were you about to say something?
Yeah, I want to go back, David, to what you were saying, because I'm not nearly as on Twitter as this. Like, I've heard you talk about Adrian Vermeule, and I'm like, okay, he's a person. But the way that you talked about the way that conservatives talk about the left, as if there's this agenda going on, and that's what I was raised in, right? That was my formation in Catholicism. So as you're speaking, I'm too. I'm like putting dots together. At some point I realized, because I was very, very involved in the pro-life movement in college. At some point I realized after college that much of the pro-life movement, at least the circles I was involved in, was more concerned with hating liberals than it was with actually promoting human rights. And that really disturbed me, right? Even when I was very conservative at that point. It's like, that's not right. But your description of, the drag queens in libraries and all this kind of stuff, I bought into that was a actual agenda, right? For a long time. But now looking back, how much of a leap is it to go from that to QAnon, to these liberal elites have kidnapped all these kids and put them in bunkers as their sex slaves and are harvesting their
adrenochrome.
Yeah.
Well, Drag Queen Story Hour is a thing.
It is a real thing. Yeah.
It's a question of whether it's part of a grand conspiracy or there's a central thing controlling it.
But the way that I was formed, the way that it was talked about, and what I believed was there is this homogenous left that has this coordinated agenda, and harming kids, especially sexually, is part of their agenda, right? And it's easy for me to see how someone can go from that, where what I believed for a long time, to QAnon. It's not a big jump.
Yeah, it's not a big jump. And I mean, there are genuine concerns, that people can have with liberalism, of course, and with leftism or whatever,
and the
right?
Sexualization of kids, absolutely.
Well, obviously, chastity isn't the left's highest priority.
No, it's not the left's highest priority. But then again, there's other. You look and you say, okay, well, there's actually these other sort of corresponding positive things. It's with liberalism, in the 1960s and after, that you get people recognizing the phenomenon of child abuse and first of all, parental child abuse, so abuse of children, and then institutional child abuse. These were the big topics among liberal academics in sociology and that sort of thing. And they were the ones who brought attention to it. So that when we start thinking about things like age of consent and child abuse and the trauma that it can inflict, the lasting trauma, we're into the realm of sort of liberal psychology, social psychology. And that's, I mean, we can't say that conservatives have been very good in that regard. They've sort of pushed that stuff under the table. So, you know, if it happens, well, it shouldn't even talk about it. You know, that sort of attitude, and sometimes allowing it to thrive because it wasn't exposed. So I think that's the thing, is that it's always so much more complicated than they'll make it seem. Now, I got to admit, I bought into this stuff too. Like like Adrian is a professor, and some of these other, like I think Patrick Deneen is a professor, and I know that when you're in liberal academia, and it is heavily liberal, it's, you know, there's that's for sure, you can feel like you're a real like minority there. You can sometimes feel like you're being persecuted, and I've experienced that. And I also had that sort of reaction that I went right to the most reactionary sort of intellectualism that I could find as a way of compensating, and sort of trying to find an intellectual tradition that I could use to fight back. But then I realized this is me and my own insecurities at play here. Like, I'm not really, I'm presenting myself in an antagonistic way, and I'm making huge generalizations about people. And so over time that's broken down, and I've realized, okay, you know, if I present myself as a Catholic, as a Christian, but do it in a respectful way, in a way that's where I'm like open to dialogue, open to other people's thinking, things actually usually work out pretty well. You know, if you come into it with the idea that, you know, all the people you're talking with in academia are, you know, evil Marxists who are, you know, out to destroy Western civilization, then you're going to have trouble, because, you know, they'll pick up on that, and they're not going to respond well to it. That's just human nature. So I think, yeah, I worry about this kind of stuff and this sort of conspiracism, because like you guys too, you know, I think we've all had a taste of it. We've all been there at one time or another. But I think, you know, for me anyway, Pope Francis was the guy who helped me come out of that, because I had to deal with certain things like that he was saying that didn't really fit into my idea of my sort of reactionary frame of mind, and that helped sort of break it apart. So I think, you know, to me, the biggest antidote to that sort of thinking has been just to listen to the Pope, try to understand on a surface level what he's trying to tell us, and then try to put that into our own thinking and our own lives.
Well, I think we're over, and I want to
We're
say
over time.
We are way over time. Sorry, guys. That should have gone during the Patreon bonus 10 minutes, but it's okay. Good stuff. Paul, where can we find you? Where can our listeners and viewers, where can they find the next of your projects?
Probably at where Peter is.
Yeah, probably. David, what do we have planned for next week?
Next week we're going to have another guest. Brett is going to be on the show, and he's
Salkeld. I think
yes,
that's how you pronounce it.
I didn't know how to pronounce his name.
Salkeld.
Brett Salkeld. Yes, and he's written some great stuff on conspiracism that you know, both you and I, Mike, have found really interesting. And I should say I am working on something to follow later on liberal conspiracy theories regarding the church. I'm currently investigating the conspiracy theory surrounding the mysterious death of Pope John Paul I, and it's fascinating how this was a huge thing in the 80s, and it played into a lot of liberal concerns, and it's sort of the same kind of thing, but from an opposite angle, and maybe we can do an episode on that in the near future.
All right. Well, thanks for watching and listening to our viewers and listeners, I guess, who watched and listened. Anyway, until next time, God bless, and take care. And here's our little goodbye song. See you later.